It started with a frantic 911 call. A woman sobbing, telling dispatchers her boyfriend was dead, found zipped inside a suitcase. She claimed it was a tragic accident, but investigators would soon uncover the shocking truth. This is the story of Sarah Boone. It was a Sunday night in Winter Park, Florida, a quiet suburban community nestled just outside Orlando. The streets were calm, the houses dark. But inside one of those homes, a nightmare was unfolding. Just after 1 p.m. on Monday, February 24, 2020, a call came into the Orange County 911 dispatch center. The voice on the other end was hysterical, a woman gasping for air between sobs. Her name was Sarah Boone. She was telling the operator something unbelievable, something horrific. She said her boyfriend, Jorge Torres Jr, was dead, and he was inside a suitcase. The dispatcher, trained for chaos, tried to calm the frantic woman. She asked Sarah to explain what happened. Through breathless cries, a story began to emerge. It sounded more like a bizarre party game gone wrong than a potential crime. Sarah claimed that the night before, she and Jorge had been drinking wine and playing a game of hide and seek. She said she had fallen asleep, leaving him hidden. She had only just woken up hours later to find him unresponsive. On that call, Sarah Boone's words painted a picture of a tragic freak accident, a moment of innocent fun that had spiraled into an unthinkable tragedy. She sounded like a woman lost in grief and shock, struggling to comprehend how her partner's life could have ended in such a strange and terrible way. How does a grown man end up in a suitcase? How does his partner not realize he is trapped inside, struggling for air just a few feet away? These were the questions that hung in the air as the first Orange County Sheriff's deputies pulled up to the apartment complex. The 911 call was the first chapter in a story that would grow darker with every detail. A story that would ultimately expose a chilling recording, a history of violence, a truth far more sinister than a simple game of hide and seek. When deputies arrived at the apartment on the 4700 block of France Lane, they found Sarah Boone on the front porch, visibly distraught. She led them inside, where they were confronted with a scene that was both tragic and profoundly strange. There, in the middle of the living room floor, was a large blue suitcase. It was partially unzipped, and just as the 911 call described, a man's body was inside. Jorge Torres Jr, 42 years old, was lifeless. His position was contorted, crammed into the tight confines of the luggage. One of his eyes was bruised and swollen shut, and he had a small cut on his lip. To the deputies, the initial scene was a mix of the mundane and the macabre. It looked like a typical domestic setting, but at its center was an object of travel now transformed into a makeshift coffin. Sarah Boone, weeping and talking quickly, guided them through her version of the events. She repeated the story she had told the 911 operator, that she and Jorge had been drinking, playing around, and decided that it would be funny if he got into the suitcase. She claimed that they both thought it was a joke. She zipped him up, one zipper at the top, one at the bottom, leaving a small gap. Then, she said, she made a mistake, a fatal mistake. She went upstairs thinking Jorge could get himself out. She told deputies she passed out in her bed and didn't wake up until the next afternoon. It was only then, she insisted, that she came downstairs and realized with dawning horror that Jorge was still inside the suitcase. She frantically unzipped it, but it was too late. He was gone. It was an accident, she sobbed. A terrible, horrible accident. The deputies listened patiently. They took notes. They observed the scene. But experienced investigators are trained to look past the tears, to see the details that don't quite add up. The cut on Jorge's lip, the black eye, the simple, nagging question of how someone could fall asleep so soundly while their partner was trapped just one floor below. The scene was confusing, but the first seeds of doubt were already being planted. As paramedics officially pronounced Jorge Torres Jr. dead at the scene, detectives from the Orange County Sheriff's Office took over. They began a more formal interview with Sarah Boone, asking her to walk them through the timeline of the previous night, step by step. She told them they fought sometimes, like any couple. In fact, public records would later show that deputies had been called to their home on previous occasions for domestic disturbances. Was this truly an accident between two lovers? Or was it the culmination of something much darker brewing beneath the surface of their lives? The story of falling asleep, of forgetting he was in there, was the centerpiece of her claim of innocence. It was everything. If she truly passed out, unaware of his plight, then it was a tragedy. But if she was awake, if she knew he was trapped and did nothing, it was something else entirely. It was murder. While Sarah Boone recounted her version of events, investigators were methodically processing the scene. And in today's world, one of the most important pieces of evidence at any scene is the cell phone. Detectives asked Sarah for her phone. Reluctantly, she handed it over. What they found would change the entire direction of the investigation. It wasn't in her texts or her call history. It was in her video gallery. There were 2 videos, recorded the previous night. The timestamps showed they were filmed long after Sarah claimed she had gone upstairs and fallen asleep. The contents of those videos were sickening. They were the missing piece of the puzzle, and they exposed her story as a calculated lie. In the first video, the phone is pointed at the blue suitcase, which is shaking and moving on the floor. A man's voice can be heard from inside, desperate and pleading. It was Jorge. "I can't fucking breathe, man," he says, muffled. "Seriously." Sarah's voice is heard in response, cold, mocking, full of rage. She laughs at him. "Yeah, that's what you do when you choke me," she taunts. He continues to beg. "I can't breathe," he says again. She replies, "Oh, that's a shame. For everything you've done to me, fuck you, stupid." A second video shows the suitcase in a different position, now facing downward. Jorge is still pleading for his life. "Sarah!" he yells. She continues to ridicule him. "That's my name, don't wear it out." He tells her again that he can't breathe. Her response, "That's on you. That's what I feel like when you cheat on me." She was not asleep. She was awake. She was aware. She was recording her boyfriend as he took his final breaths, suffocating inside the very suitcase she had zipped him into. The case had just turned from a tragic accident into a cold-blooded murder. To understand what happened on that terrible night in February, you have to look back at the history between Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. Theirs was not a fairy tale romance. It was a relationship forged in instability and fueled by alcohol, a volatile mix of passion and poison. Sarah, a bartender who had moved to the Orlando area, met Jorge, a father of 3 who worked in construction. Friends described an initial spark, a powerful attraction, but beneath the surface, a destructive pattern was already taking hold. A cycle of intense fights followed by tearful reconciliations. Public records paint a grim picture. Police were called to their shared residences multiple times. These weren't simple disagreements. They were domestic disputes requiring police intervention, with allegations of violence from both sides. Detectives began to suspect the night was not an isolated incident or a freak accident, but the final fatal act in a long-running drama of domestic strife. The answer seemed buried in the wreckage of their cursed courtship. On the evening of February 25, 2020, less than 36 hours after she made that frantic 911 call, Sarah Boone was placed under arrest. She was charged with second-degree murder in the death of Jorge Torres Jr. The charge reflected a killing that was not premeditated in the legal sense, but was committed with a depraved mind, an act of ill will and hatred. Her mugshot, showing a woman with disheveled hair and a look of weary disbelief, would soon be broadcast across news outlets, the face of a crime so bizarre and cruel it was hard to comprehend. Sarah Boone was booked into the Orange County Jail and held without bond. The woman who had filmed her boyfriend's death was now confined herself, trading her apartment for a jail cell. As Sarah Boone sat in jail awaiting trial, her court-appointed attorneys faced a mountain of incriminating evidence. A traditional not guilty defense seemed almost impossible, so her legal team began to construct a new narrative that reframed her actions. The defense would be built on a history of abuse and a diagnosis of battered woman syndrome. The strategy put Jorge Torres Jr. on trial alongside Sarah. They planned to argue she was the long-suffering victim of a violent, controlling partner. The taunts on the video were, in their view, trauma, not malice. They argued zipping Jorge in the suitcase was not calculated revenge, but a disorganized, trauma-driven response. She was not in her right mind. Was Sarah a sadistic killer who documented her crime, or a traumatized victim whose desperate act ended in tragedy? The jury would decide. After years of delays, the trial of Sarah Boone finally commenced on October 14, 2024. The prosecution presented its case with stark, chilling simplicity. They played the videos for the jury. The defense, in turn, presented their narrative of a woman broken by abuse. Sarah Boone herself took the stand, a risky and dramatic move. She wept as she described a relationship of fear and violence, portraying Jorge as a monster. The jury was left to weigh 2 starkly different realities. They had to reconcile the weeping woman on the witness stand with the cold, taunting voice on the video. On October 25, 2024, the jury returned. The verdict was read, guilty of second-degree murder. On December 2, 2024, Sarah Boone returned to the courtroom one last time for her sentencing. Before the judge handed down his decision, the court heard from the family of Jorge Torres Jr. They spoke of a loving father, a cherished brother, and a kind soul whose life had been brutally extinguished. They asked the judge for the maximum possible sentence. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah Boone maintained her innocence. She did not apologize. She did not express remorse for her actions. Citing the extreme cruelty and the absolute lack of remorse, the judge sentenced Sarah Boone to the maximum penalty allowed by law, life in the Florida Department of Corrections with no possibility of parole. In the end, Jorge Torres Jr. lost his life inside a suitcase, while the woman who claimed to love him recorded his final breaths. Sarah Boone now faces the consequences of her actions in a courtroom, and the world is left to ask, was it rage, revenge, or cold-blooded murder? Thank you for watching this Twisted Tuesday true crime story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Do you think Sarah Boone deserves life in prison? Or do you believe her story that it was an accident? We'll see you next time.